Yes, good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to moderate about the panel Democracy in the Information Age, put to the task. As introduced, I work for POLITICO, which you probably know. I've been working in the past years in Brussels a lot, covered the EU. I've been now for about 2 years, covered especially the new German government. And if you've looked a little bit into the biography, you might have seen that actually I started at Computer Bild, which is a big German consumer electronics magazine, which also looks into internet security and internet economics. That's where I started. So it's actually, for me, a bit back to the roots now. So linking these two things, internet companies, digital media, social media, and the political dimension, especially also democracies, the impact. And I think we all have seen quite a lot of worrying trends in recent years. I mean, I'm thinking of 6th of January in the United States in 2021. More recently, what has happened in Brazil, where social media, where the internet has played quite a worrying role for democracies. And we're looking, of course, at the war in Russia. We're looking at, the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. We're seeing all the disinformation that's happening there. We're seeing the challenge as well by China. And at the same time, I think there are also some opportunities coming from social media, coming from technologies. And I would like to discuss this here at the panel for about 40 minutes with my guests, and then we also have some time for questions. So without further ado, I'm calling up in no particular order, just alphabetical order. I'll start with Michael Berthold. Please join me on the stage. Michael is the co-founder of KNIME from the beautiful southern German city of Konstanz, or Konstanz, as you would say, for the yeah, so, and he is mostly, with his platform, open analytics, data experts, and mining data. So he's really the technical expert here on the stage. And I think he has a lot of interesting things to say also about how technologies really in the nitty-gritty have an impact on our broader political sphere and our democracies. Then we have Barbara Comstock. Please come on. She's a former member of Congress until 2019, right? Now a senior advisor at Baker Donelson law firm, and you've also worked at the Justice Department. You have a lot of experience also from the transatlantic side, from the other side of the Atlantic, on transatlantic relations, on data regulations. I think that will be very interesting to discuss with you. We've got Laurie Richardson, Vice President for Trust and Safety at Google. And Laurie, you've been working a lot in all sorts of data security, privacy issues for Google. I think you have a lot to say also about these issues, right? And you also work for the Obama administration, I should say. We have Vivian Schiller, Executive Director at Aspen Digital. And what I find most interesting about Vivian is that you have worked at Twitter as well. So I think we all want to talk about that. And joining digitally, I hope she's already there. Yes, Lorena, Jaume-Palasí, bienvenida, from Spain, or from where you're joining us now?
From Brandenburg, actually.
From Brandenburg. Oh, you.
Not that far away.
It's not so far away, okay. But you've also looked a lot into technologies and regulation, if I'm right, and how this is influencing our political sphere, our democracies. You've worked at this committee, and I always need to look it up, the European Parliament's Science and Technology Opinions Assessment Panel or Committee, to also look into these fields. GDPR, of course, is a big term there we've been working on. And yeah, so welcome very much. I think that should be my seat. So, and I thought we start off with a little question to each of you before we go into a broader discussion. And as we all probably feel it, when we have a question, we first go to Google. That's a usual thing these days. So, Laurie, I'd like to ask you, so I've painted a bit of more of a gloomy picture in my brief introduction here, talking especially about all these challenges. I talked about Brazil, what we see in the US with the storm of the Capitol, where, of course, social media and technology played a big role. We see the disruption through disinformation, the challenges from China. So how do you qualify this at Google in your job, and what maybe positive elements can you add to this?
Thanks for the question, and it's really great to be here. It's great to be in Berlin and grateful to be a part of this conversation. So my job at Google is that I lead a large team called Trust and Safety, and we are responsible for setting the policies for all of our products, search, ads, YouTube, which has a separate Trust and Safety team that we work very closely with, Play, and our new generative AI products, and we also enforce those policies. So, all of the trends that we're talking about today are things that we think about as a team and as a company every single day. The rise of geopolitics and the instability in so many ways of the world as we find it today. New and emerging forms of technology that actually test the boundaries and the paradigms that we've arrived at and trying to, over the last couple of decades, find the right balance between government, the private sector, and civil society, and how we answer some of these questions. And of course, a new wave of regulations that is coming out of Europe and all over the world that is also seeking to answer these really big and important questions that we're asking ourselves around how we strike the right balance between competing principles like privacy and competition, child safety, free expression, and safety online. So it is certainly a big and dynamic moment. So what's the good news? I think that we are learning how to work with partners in a better and deeper way to get to answers around some of these questions. Both in terms of partnerships with governments as the Digital Services Act comes online, and it's transforming and in many ways helping do what my team's been doing for a very long time, which is to think about how the choices that we make and how we design and deploy technology products impact the people who use them and societies around us. And we've been working closely, obviously, with the EU and EC as we try to move forward in realizing the potential of that new piece of regulation. We are also understanding and able to respond to the broader concerns of civil society around us. And that's all important because these core technology products, I do believe, are essentially a force for good. We saw this in Russia-Ukraine when, after the invasion, technology companies were able to work very, very quickly to put policies in place to help stop, and we are continuing to work on this together with governments to help stop the spread of Russian disinformation. Products like Google Maps that actually provides identifiers for refugee services. Products like Google Search, which helps people find information when they most need it by putting up SOS alerts in the wake of crises events. And YouTube, which does seek to give voice to people who historically have not had a voice. And all of that comes with a lot of responsibility. But I think the good news is that we're learning how to do this better, we're learning how to do this well, and we're existing in such a dynamic space that we're going to have to figure out how to partner together because nobody can solve any of these challenges alone.
Since you just mentioned YouTube, I wanted to follow up there briefly. I personally, as a journalist, have been encountering this in recent years quite a lot, that there has been a lot of fake news. We had it, for example, on YouTube with the white helmets in Syria. It was quite a controversy. I think some people might remember that it was actually Russian or Syrian propaganda on YouTube quite a lot with these documentations. Also, we've seen this also with Ukraine, and of course it's a very narrow barrier about what is actually documentation with maybe some controversial political spin in there, but it could still be legit information. What is actually disinformation that is clearly seeking to, for example, spin a pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, etc. narrative? So how do you tackle this challenge?
I think the first thing to think about and understand about what's happening across all of these platforms at Google is our first job is to make sure that we're raising up and making accessible high-quality information. In a way, that's what Google's been doing for a couple of decades, which is people are looking for information. How do you make sure you're being responsive to what they're looking for? And YouTube tries to do that well, too. But there are other levers that YouTube uses. Obviously, disinformation campaigns and information operations are a component of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we've put in lots of measures to sort of detect and disrupt disinformation operations. We work with trusted partners across Europe to flag and respond to disinformation when it's identified. But a lot of this is seriously hard questions and hard to understand what's on the right side of the line between something that we may disagree with and something that actually qualifies as disinformation. And so getting that balance right takes a lot of cooperation with government.
Right. Vivian, I introduced you already as somebody who worked at Twitter, and of course, dealing with disinformation, moderating content is something you've been working with, and you've observed also what has happened since. So what is your take on the state of social media and also on Twitter these days and the impact it has?
Yeah, it's really actually quite devastating what's happened to Twitter. Twitter used to have a team very much like the team that Laurie led, a very large and generally very effective, not perfect, but generally effective trust and safety team. Unfortunately, almost all of them were fired the first couple of days after Elon Musk took ownership of the company, and the ones that were left hoping to be there to sort of, staunch the tide of horrible information became so frustrated that they quit. So it's now Twitter is just, it's open season for all kinds of, for coordinated and disinformation campaigns, for bad actors, for all kinds of nonsense and garbage on the Twitter platform, which is really a shame. It is very hard. These content moderation decisions, it's very easy to pick out screw-ups. But content moderation is extremely hard. It is never going to be perfect. The best that you can do is to keep trying. But in the case of Twitter, you now have an owner with accountability to no one who has decided that it's not a priority, and also based on some of his own tweets, clearly is someone who doesn't care very much about evidence-based reality. So it's not great. And I will say that what's happening at Twitter, where basically one man is in charge, just like at Facebook, which is I think still trying much harder than Elon Musk is, also accountable to one person, is shining a bright light on concerns when you have a single individual. Google's a little bit different situation. A single individual who ultimately has this decision making in his hands, and I'm saying his here because they're all men.
So a lot of this also comes down to regulation, of course, and the question of whether we should regulate more, do stricter regulations also for platforms like Twitter. It was already mentioned before here by Laurie that regulation is something she deals very much with. So Barbara, you've been working in the US, you're joining us from Washington. I think you just got into Berlin yesterday.
Yes.
So how do you see the necessity and the broader chances also to regulate a platform like Twitter and have a chance to actually steer the communication there in a way that it's not imperiling, endangering for democracies?
Well, I think, over the past few years, given my background, as you mentioned, I first worked in Congress, then I worked in the Justice Department, and then I myself, ran for office. I was first in state government, where I represented an area that was very active in the tech community in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. I was chair of technology committee. Then I was in Congress, where I also chaired that and worked very closely with the technology community. And I think as you look over the past 3 years, since COVID, since the whole Ukraine, war, I think you've really seen a lot of the positive things that we can deal with tech. And even post-January 6th, a lot of what we've been able to identify through social media, while social media had a role in being able to organize January 6th, social media was very active in January 6th miscreants and criminals. These were not bright people who were out there filming themselves, putting everything up on YouTube, on social media, and as a result, we have hundreds and even thousands of people who have now been arrested and who are going through prosecutions because they put the video themselves up on social media. On January 6th, they thought it was all fun and games. They forgot it was criminal. But also, during COVID, my husband's a teacher. I have 3 children. They're now all educating their kids. I'm fortunately part of a 4-generation family, so I was able to see, my kids, working from home, educating their children from home during COVID, using technology, sometimes in a lot of good ways, sometimes in challenging ways. My husband had to do hybrid teaching. Tech was at the forefront really before government was there. They were coming in and showing us how to do it. Government, a lot slower. I was my husband's in a private school now. He retired from public schools. His public school system was a disaster. He'd compare with his friends who were still in the public school system. They weren't figuring it out. His private school system was doing a good job doing the hybrid system. Google and one of my school systems I used to represent, they came in and gave free Chromebooks to all the kids, if they didn't have that. And so, you really saw a lot of good ways to deal with this. And now we are, going forward, finding a lot of those hybrid work ways to work, in education. And then I think you also had telehealth just, went through the roof. Mental health, people who were isolated before, now, because of tech, we saw great ways, and now government has expanded their telehealth expenditures, and they're going to keep that in there. I know we're going to talk about Ukraine more later. So
definitely.
I think a lot of the positive things we can learn in terms of what do we need to regulate and how we can do it. And I think certainly, the previous speaker, the US and the EU obviously have better models, I think. Democratic, I think the democracies, if we aren't the ones leading in terms of economically, militarily, it is going to be very dangerous to have a world where China is leading. So even though we have very different ways of how we want to work on this, and I think it's not just that I am a free market, free speech Republican, distance myself from the autocratic, dictatorial Donald Trump, who led an insurrection on our country. So I think he's more in the China model. I do want to point out there's some real differences in the United States on this also. Josh Hawley, I would put more kind of in the EU model, strangely. So, you do have a lot of different models in the US too. But I do think we've seen a lot of good use, throughout the world over these past years, just through, necessity has been the mother of invention. So now the democracies can come together and say, where have we really done a good job? And let's take those examples and find where maybe we can have a little humility. Certainly government isn't known for being humble, but having sat through a lot of hearings on technology, I can tell you government isn't always the best, certainly members of Congress aren't known for their brilliance on technology, and I will.
You're referring to the Mark Zuckerberg hearing?
So maybe we shouldn't be the ones that really mess. I know when I had hearings, I was usually asking them, what can we do to help you, get health cures faster, help our economy grow faster, do things to, get things to market faster and say when we have natural disasters, get you there quicker, not have me over-regulate in a way that gums things up.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned also the great potential, of course, of teleworking and participating in conferences. So teleworking, exactly. And joining us from Brandenburg now, I would like to give over to Lorena, because you also look especially in this angle. I don't even know where to look at you. Maybe this angle is best. I don't know where the camera is, where you see me best. But you've been really looking into this intersection of technology and regulation, and also you've been advising, for example, the European Parliament on that, and we have mentioned the European Digital Single Market. We had GDPR a couple of years ago, where Europe actually set what a lot of people say is a gold standard now for data and technology, and also our data that we're all handing out to all these companies, mostly in the US. So Europeans want to have a say on that. So how do you see the potential and the need to regulate more? Are we there yet, or do we need to do more?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. I don't think that we're yet there. I think that we are trying to regulate in advance a lot of technologies whose impact we don't understand yet. When we talk about, for instance, many artificial intelligence systems, we need to acknowledge that we have quite low implementation in Europe, for instance. And when I mean in Europe, I actually mean the European Union, which is 27 countries, but Europe is a continent and it has way more countries, apart those 26. And I think it's important that that when regulating, we understand better what are the real consequences and conflicts that we have with many of the systems that we're trying in advance to understand. And right now we are regulating a lot of systems as a product, but actually many artificial intelligence systems are not a product, they are a technology. And as that, they work like an infrastructure. So there's no way to regulate them in the same way as you would regulate, for instance, let's say something that you can eat, like food that you just produce, and once it's produced, you just can place it in the market. But it's a technology that's always evolving, and the way you implement it might differ a lot from the way how you released that technology. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings about the technology, how we use it. There's also a lot of expectations on technology that we see in many of the pieces of regulation that we're having. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainties, but because right now, the way how we're regulating AI, it's sort of an abrupt breach in the way how European Union has been regulating traditionally, because usually when we regulate, we have a sectoral approach to things. So we would regulate very specifically technology within the medical sector and the health sector in a specific way with very specific standards and very specific set of defined risks. We would do the same for the finance sector. We would do the same for the social security sector to get a hold on each sector of technology. And suddenly we are more and more starting to regulate in what is called a horizontal approach, which means that we sort of try to create general rules for regulation that must be applied across all different sectors. And that is a sort of turn, so to say, in the legal methodology. And I'm not sure that that's the right approach, to be honest, on the one side. And what we're also doing is sort of detaching many of the conflicts that we see in many new technologies from the whole context. And we're trying to solve problems by separating, so to say, the different aspects of a problem. So, for instance, when we talk about AI systems, artificial intelligence systems, we are detaching from that part the whole environmental issue, the whole energy issue, the whole raw material and prime and critical resources issues. We have different regulations for that. And to a certain extent, when we talk about regulating AI, we're sort of forgetting that that when we imply that we want to foster specific forms of systems, like, let's say, electric cars that are AI-led, that we're also implying that we're going to need specific raw materials like lithium. and that many of the critical materials that we need for digital products are outside Europe, and that this also requires specific regulation. And this sort of regulation, for instance, that is very and deeply connected to many of the digital services and issues that we want to have, and so to say, structures that we're creating, are detached fully from the legal approach on AI. So I think that right now we have different realities, so to say.
So
I'm calling from Brandenburg. People here do not have mostly access to internet, so they have to go to the roof to use their cell phones. There's very bad connection. And actually, the problems that they have is, for instance, water, which is the reason why Google got rejected to install their data center here in Brandenburg, which is something that they wanted to do last year. And in the end, they had to step back from that idea because there's not enough water here. And we already have Tesla, the gigafactory, Tesla's gigafactory, which is already consuming so much water that we already have water cuts, and that schools cannot be erected because the water resource institutions are denying them the certificate because there's not enough water to provide for the schools. So we cannot build new schools and we cannot build new business over here because there's not enough water. So that's one reality that we have there, and that's deeply intertwined with new digital services and new digital models that physically exist here. And that reality leaves also with all that was described before.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that's very interesting what you also mentioned about this holistic regulation approach, and where you said the horizontal approach as such maybe doesn't work alone. We need to look also at critical raw materials. For example, at the next panel we will talk about trade. I think that's going to be also very interesting, so to go into that deeper, the Inflation Reduction Act, and there, of course, these elements also play an important role. And you also already mentioned artificial intelligence, and I introduced Michael as so to say our AI and data experts at KNIME. So artificial intelligence, we see this as a huge help. I mean, in my work as a journalist, I write in English most of the time, but I am German, often speak to German interlocutors. One tool I use a lot is DeepL, actually German startup, very cool and good, I think, in translating, but there's so many other things. We see ChatGPT also now actually becoming a problem for university professors or teachers because people or students, they try to write their paper with a chatbot, and the other day I saw on Twitter interesting thread about how to actually detect, and if it's still possible for teachers or university professors to detect this kind of cheating. So how do you see AI going forward? Is it more of a challenge, or do you see also there a big threat that these things going all the way to deep fakes, etc., could influence, can disrupt our democracies?
I mean, we seem to be focusing on the negative aspects a lot more. I think there's a lot of amazing
I want
potential
you guys to bring
AI.
the positive in there, yeah.
And I think things like automatically translating meaningfully is just one tiny little aspect. I mean, AI is not new. I've been doing AI research 25 years ago at Carnegie Mellon. So I've just had a little bit of less of an impact. I think the really interesting challenge when it comes to this regulation aspect is like the Googles and the Twitters, they don't do that anymore, but the Facebooks of the world, they're focusing on an old problem, right? Regulating, they can regulate now what is already about to be outdated, and they're struggling to do that, right? What they're regulating is essentially saying, okay, we need to ban that particular person because they're posting bad stuff. We have human moderators that are finding spam or disinformation. We're filtering this out. But we are now at a stage where we have technology that generates content, right? And it's not human designed content anymore. It's content that was designed by something that was built based on information that we cannot trace back. So the human moderation team at Google, I'm sorry, they will be out of work soon because everything looks perfect, right? You get text.
I disagree with that, but I do think our jobs will change.
The jobs will change. Okay, sorry. Good. Okay. They're not out of job. They have a very different job because they now need to actually go in and understand the content and go back to the sources that they can't really find and figure out if it sounds true It seems true, but actually fundamentally it's not. And I think to me it sounds a little bit like a lot of these technology catch-ups that we've done in the past couple of years as well. I mean, spam detection, right? Then you devise better spam things. I mean, right now all of what Google does is in principle explainable to outsiders. You don't want to do that because then people work around it, right? The way search results get pulled out of the World Wide Web is actually understandable, right? It's hardcore math, but in principle it's understandable, and of course you want to keep that secret, otherwise people optimize around it so that their posts get top rating. But that's over, right? Now we're generating stuff, and we're coming up with results that nobody can explain. All of this buzz around explainable AI is bullshit. It's impossible to explain what AI does. If I could use that model. All I can do is get close to kind of explaining some aspects of the information that were used to come to that decision. But really understanding how that complex AI system came up with that explanation is impossible. Otherwise, I wouldn't need that complex AI system in the first place. And I think that's going to be super interesting, right? And I think it will lead to us needing to accept that artificial intelligence systems make really, really, really stupid mistakes at times, where we think, how could you, right? But on some other aspects are amazing. I find it interesting that people still don't step foot in self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are safer than human drivers, but they make really stupid mistakes. And that's something we don't accept. We don't accept human error from a robot.
We already have the first question from the audience, and of course I encourage you to also submit us our questions. So one question here is anonymously, how can the US contribute to strengthen the EU to find an effective strategy in the systemic conflict with China? And actually, Vivian, I want to go over there to you, also to the previous speaker we had here, which described also that we have very different model with the US, I mean, I'm polarizing a bit, but the US being very business-driven, market-driven, the EU being value-driven, and then there's China, an autocratic system, and these three different layers, so to say. Is there a way for the EU and the US to work together and to deal with autocrats like China?
Yeah, well, yeah, and by the way, I thought that her construct was very clever and smart. The idea of U.S. being market-driven, Europe being rights-driven, and China being, what did she say, government-driven or state-driven. On the other hand, I think it's too neat a construct, to be perfectly honest. There have always been techno-libertarians in the U.S. There will always be techno-libertarians, but it is not the prevailing view of most Americans, and so I'm not sure that I buy that construct. I think, however, she did point out something that I think fundamentally, and again, everything is shades of gray, that fundamentally is true, which is the free speech orientation around the U.S. and the more sort of, I'll call it rather than rights, because I think everybody agrees on rights. I will call it more an anti-harms orientation in the EU is very interesting, and I think that is actually a fundamental tension, which is, and it's on a continuum, right? Which is, are you willing? This is putting it really grossly. Are you willing to tolerate more harms in the spirit of speech, or are you willing to suppress speech, including necessary speech to prevent potential harms? So I'm not sure that's related necessarily to China, and I realize that there are trade issues concerned, which is not my area of expertise, but I do think that there is more in common between the EU and the US, that sort of central dichotomy I just mentioned, accepting that radically differentiates the collective of the US orientation and the EU orientation from China, with the possible exception of Josh Hawley. I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. or the EU that looks at that is looking for that level of state control.
And I also wanted to say, if you have questions, if you can't submit them digitally, you may also raise your hand, of course. But still following up, Barbara, I want to also ask you on China, because we see really this very different model of China. I think Lorena highlighted this point on trade, which is very important, that of course technology regulation goes at with critical raw materials is linked to trade, of course, as well. There we have, especially here in Germany, huge dependency on China, and we've seen ASML in the Netherlands now being kind of like forced to reduce its trade and its dependency on China, both in imports but also exports and business activities there. But when we look really at the technological aspect and the control that China has, the grip that the Chinese government really has on controlling everything that's going on there in the internet, but also influencing the narrative elsewhere. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, and they've been cracking down a lot on their tech. You know, they want to control that more, whereas we have a lot more freedom in ours, and a lot of the opposition, certainly from a free market standpoint, to some of the the antitrust suggestions that come from left and right in the United States. It's a weird combination, both of the support for regulation has a left-right support, and the opposition comes from both the left and the right and the center. So, but the argument for those of us who oppose a lot of the increase in regulation is that it will weaken our technological ability to compete against China. And a lot of it has not really been thought out in terms of our competitiveness against China in terms of, economically, militarily. Some of the requirements it puts on there would increase the ability, it would open up some of the, systems to allow bad actors to get into our systems in a way that we have protected them so they cannot. And so that is not, some of the complaints from, some of the competitor, we have a system, ours is about, protecting the consumer.
Right.
Our antitrust system is, if the consumers like it, and our consumers, by and large, one of the things I did not see when I was in Congress, people coming in and complaining about, I don't like my phone, I don't like, they like their phones. They had an Android, they had an Apple phone, they're happy with their phones, they like their computers. I usually did not have people standing outside my office complaining about their computers or their phones weren't working. But you have people who might be, competitors, so the difference of competitors who may not have as good a product wanting to, might be complaining that they don't like the, who they're competing with. So that's a very, it's a different way of looking at things, in the United States. So the competitors come in and try and talk to, people in Congress about, hey, I want to get a piece of that market. We look at the system, in the United States as, the system that has developed over the past 30 years is about consumer-driven, lowering the prices, making it better for the consumers. And that makes us more competitive against China.
But you're actually making the case for less regulation there, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, or well thought out regulation that makes us more competitive, in the international community, and making sure in terms of national security that we are protecting, our companies that have developed these. The United States does have, the top technology companies in the world. China is coming up trying to take a lot of that space from us. We don't want to give up that space, and certainly from a national security standpoint, we feel it's very important that we don't give up that space.
When it comes to bringing the EU and US together, maybe one thought I had is I always think back a couple of years when we still had TTIP, and we talked about also bringing not only trade, but also technology and values together, creating joint standards actually between the EU and the US that are then become world standards that would eventually force China also to accept that standard rather. We have this Trade and Technology Council we will talk about in a bit, also the other panel a bit further, but Laurie, maybe just, do you see this, we heard less regulation, otherwise we can't compete with China. Do you see it the same way, or do you see that the EU and the US can actually do something together that would create leverage toward China?
Or light touch regulation.
Light touch, okay.
I think I agree with both of you, and let me square that. I think what the Congresswoman is saying, pointing at, that's really, really important, is we have to hold together the notion that, yes, it is important to have smart and good balance and regulation of all industries, including the technology industry. And yes, there are geopolitical issues at stake too, and we need to be able to hold that together. I think quite often it feels like policymakers are thinking in compartmentalized ways when it comes to these issues, and sort of going full bore ahead and not necessarily squaring across what some of the national security interests may be. And I think that does lead us to a place where we need to be in a principles and standards-based alignment across democratic coalitions in a transatlantic way that might help write the rules for this next wave of technology that I think you provocatively but probably accurately pointed to as hugely disruptive and consequential, and a moment where if we haven't gotten our act together yet to try to think more holistically, now is really the time to understand what's at stake and set the right rules, standards, and norms around it so that we can, technology is going to march forward whether US companies do it or European companies do it or Chinese companies or other companies. It's happening. So how do we do it well? And that takes a lot of collaboration and investment in coming up with the right structures.
And as you pointed out, oftentimes what Congress is doing is for the old problems, not for the new. So you start regulating and you're not...
But that's regulation tends to lag behind, and in technology that's a problem because, like you say, we march ahead anyway. But I like talking about standards much more than regulations, right? It's a little bit like you guarantee quality, not I'm not going to screw with your data. And I think there's a lot. GDPR has a very negative touch to it. We could have phrased that as a DIN norm, for instance, right? What kind of norms, standards do you need to fulfill with your software to get that stamp of approval, right? I mean, like I'm not a German patriot, but anyway, like the made in Germany, right? That had a ring to it at some point in time. Could be made by a democracy norm.
One question from the audience from Ned Wiley. On that point, TTIP and TTC, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, whether that's actually enough or whether there should be even more aggressive towards China when it comes to technology on cracking down the disruptive effects. Any thoughts on that? Michael, you have a take?
Technology is darn easy to copy. I find that. I mean, it blocks them briefly if you boycott them, but all you do in the end is that they start copying it and rebuilding it themselves, and they have the technology to build the technology. So I don't really think that helps us in the long run.
Yeah, and I think one problem also we see now with the war in Ukraine is that we're realizing that the West, or our perceptions of democracies, of state, of rule of law, of international law even, is not as well perceived all over the world and as accepted as we thought maybe. Because you could say, okay, Russia is invading Ukraine and everybody is condemning it, but if you look at the UN, there's still a couple of countries that are not doing it, some important countries that are kind of like on the fence, so I guess in technology it would be the same a bit if we were trying to completely shut out China.
And some stuff, I mean, for instance, our software is open source, right? We can't even control where it's being used. So you can tell me all day long that I'm not allowed to deliver it to Russia, but the Russians can download it and use it. And they use our commercial software too, by the way, as we see. But that's, I mean, it's super easy to copy software.
And I actually got here a question from Ned Wiley. I misattributed. It was a different question about the aggressiveness, but the actual question about Ned Wiley, I want to bring that one up also to you, is actually whether ChatGPT will become actually, or will successfully challenge the current dominant tech companies like Alphabet and Google. And of course, Laurie, you can also weigh in on that one.
Oh man, that's pure speculation. I think a lot of the larger techs are very entrenched already, and they have, I mean, Google has a phenomenal AI department. I'd be shocked if, okay, they hit a couple of bumps early on, but they will have very, very similar technology very soon. So I don't think it's a challenge. It's more of another one of those, let's try to get this done. And I see more M&A going forward, like what Microsoft is doing with OpenAI right now. So that will happen. They will buy the innovation, but I don't think the big techs will disappear. I'd be surprised. Hopefully Twitter does, but that's a different story.
I would be surprised, Laurie, if you disagree with that, but I still want to hear your take on that.
Well, the ChatGPT is working with Microsoft, so the premise, let's talk about that. And it's also built on Google Research, which was open sourced and made available, as we've done with our research for a long time, and powered by TensorFlow, which is also a Google product. So to the point of technology flows like water and people build on it and use it, it's an important one. I guess the point I'd make about looking into the future is, yes, we have been leading on both research and application of AI for a long time now. There are a lot of people out there. It's a highly competitive space. One thing that I think Google has a strength is that for also a long time we've been trying to come up with high quality answers to questions. And that's going to be really important as we seek to realize the positive potential here and mitigate the possible downside impacts.
Vivian,
I just want to add a point about, because we really should be talking a lot about generative AI. I think, in the sort of the lightning bolt that came from the sky, figuratively, when ChatGPT was open to the public in the beginning of December, is both a consequentially important moment and also a meaningless moment. It was a meaningless moment in the sense of this technology is not new. Google has the same, if not much better, capabilities. That's just a demonstrable fact. So this isn't new. However, the fact that ChatGPT came out with such a user-friendly design really sort of, for most people who were not paying attention, was mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing if you haven't been paying attention. So, now all of the money is flowing into generative AI. Everybody's like, metaverse, what? Web3, blockchain, what? It's all about generative AI. So the kind of money and attention, I think, will further drive change.
We already have a question there from the audience. I'm not sure whether you have a microphone. Yeah, that's coming over there to sir over there. Thank you.
A short question to Laurie and Michael. We had the the COVID seasons. Yeah, and you are working with data. And I wonder why you have not found a way out of the chaos of data. I'm not asking, using AI for a vaccine, but just to make transparency in the chaos of data. Why not?
Do you want to start?
I'll take that first. I think actually we have done the job. It was just not communicated properly.
I don't understand.
Actually, the reason that we had that drug so early is data science plus. Bringing the drug to market within, 18 months? It's never been done before. And that's a win for data science. That's a win for the type of technology that we built. The data was, I was trying to follow that. At the early days, it was actually understandable what was going on. It was often communicated differently. And the problem was everybody expected new results every day. You cannot get new results from data every day, right? It's something that you aggregate over time. And people should have simply said, okay, that's what we learned this month. Let's wait until next month. So a lot of that was just feverish reporting, trying to get new information out every day. That, in my mind, caused a lot of the chaos. And it's hard to be patient in a situation like that. I get that too, but I think that's part of the reason. And the rest is probably Google. Why didn't you fix the problem?
Yeah, Laurie.
I actually think it's our experience through COVID is a good example of how interdependent and holistic all of these systems are, because data is, that technology companies are able to both make available and process and analyze is only as good as raw data that we have. And so public health systems all over the world struggled to produce reliable and I think sets of data that were speaking to each other in a way that made it easy to understand. We did okay, but as just an individual, like we all were living through a world crisis, I think we were craving something that felt more regular and systematic. But I'll echo Michael's comments that also some really extraordinary things happened, and I think it's important to remember that.
Over there, please.
Hi, I have this question, I guess, is to all the tech experts on the panel. We briefly said, especially with the generative AI and the sort of even bigger shifts that are coming, we need to think more fundamentally beyond just sort of content regulation or whatever. And so my question would be, if you were to think as fundamentally as you could about the model of, and sorry, Laurie, this will be probably difficult for you, especially of the model of huge things that used to be something like a public sphere potentially being in the hands of, you know, one person. And yes, we have, in the US at least, private media that's always been private, but there was editorial, you know, embedded in the system. And so if we want to stick with private, what do we need with editorial, or is it even way bigger than that? So what's the biggest answer we should be either giving or at least looking for that we haven't quite gotten to here?
I'm not sure I understood the question completely.
So in terms of regulation, if we think much bigger than regulation, and we think what's wrong with the fundamental model of the Googles and the Facebooks, Metas, and the Twitters controlling most of the information space that most people are using, what's the bigger thing we need to do, especially as it's going to be harder? Yeah, I mean, I think you're in my sweet spot.
Yeah. So you know the expression, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Yeah. So I'm a hammer insofar as I've spent almost my entire career in journalism. And the answer is journalism, particularly at the local level, where it has been, in the United States, and not just in the United States, destroyed, decimated, crackdowns on a free press. It is, the data show that where in local communities in the US, where there is independent free press, there is greater levels of civic engagement, higher levels of voting, less polarization in those communities. And so the way to squash, look, there's no simple answer as what do we do about bad information. There are many answers to that, not singular answers. But one of the most fundamental is to make sure that there is, particularly at the local level, all over the world, good information being generated by professional journalists.
And the emphasis there is good.
Yeah, well, right,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of
course,
bad.
Yes.
If I might jump into that.
I can only.
If I might jump into that.
But, yeah.
I think Lorena.
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes.
It's really complicated to jump into the discussions being over here. I think it's important in this context to also go back to what science has been doing for many years, because all the question about disinformation and misinformation, it's not new. It's simply, it has a new digital dimension to a very old phenomenon. And scientists used to look at the concept of propaganda, because it has a lot to do with the idea of propaganda, what we're talking about, by looking at the capacity that people have to see dissenting opinion. And that's what it comes at for scientists to measure the degree in which disinformation penetrates a specific country. So it's not about what you are looking, because it's really normal that people surround themselves with people that feel the same, that agree on the same things, and read newspapers that cater for their own political position. That's quite normal. And the point here is, can you go at the streets and walk through the underground and see kiosks with newspapers from very different political positions? Can you hear people that have a different opinion? Or do you have the impression that there's a lot of people that have the same opinion like you? That's what it comes at when we talk about disinformation. So the question about disinformation is way more complicated, and I think it's important to not fall for the myth that Twitter owns the whole public sphere, because it doesn't. public sphere is way more complex than just Twitter. And a lot of people do not have access to Twitter. It's a very specific profile that has and uses Twitter. Also, I think it's important to think about the idea of good information is going to change people's opinions, because it's not. We've seen that during COVID times. There's a lot of people that were confronted with scientific facts, and instead of then changing their opinions, they were radicalized in their own political position. Right. Why? Because confronting people with facts sometimes show that it's not about facts, but it's about proving that you are loyal to a specific ideology and to a specific political movement.
I think that's exactly the point where you're making also with Twitter and other networks, that we've got one news feed that is kind of like monopolizing almost our attention, and we don't have this diversion probably anymore. I'm sorry that I need to cut you off a little bit, but we have only a few minutes left. I still want to give the chance to one more question from the audience if there's one more.
I was going just to add another aspect of that too, is to get a variety of, don't get in information silos, get a variety of different information. So your local media, your national media, social media, no form of media should be the only way you are gathering information. That's one of the problems that we have today.
Right, because otherwise we have the problem of disinformation, even professional disinformation, for example, coming from Russia. I had the sir over there in the yeah, well, I read for quite a while.
Wow. Okay. I will answer it this way. I don't think that Twitter should have blocked that story, and for a whole bunch of reasons, which we probably don't have enough time to talk about.
Yeah. And last week, Twitter testified to that in Congress themselves.
Yeah. We had one more question over there. Yeah. Two more questions. We try a very, very brief question, please.
Well, I've been kind of surprised that this entire panel seems really anti-government, and the things that you're asking for example, having adequate funding for local newspapers. You know, the fact that all of the advertising money went to Facebook and Google that used to go into print journalism, right? That requires redistribution, that requires government. So all the things you want, we normally coordinate through government. Why do you think government is such a bad idea when I agree with you on all these things about, you know, polarization and disinformation preceding the digital era? All those kinds of things are right. But why is government a bad?
Laurie?
Did we say government?
Laurie, you were for less regulation.
First, no, what I'm saying light touch regulation. That doesn't mean you don't have, you know, if you have violations or antitrust violations, that doesn't mean you don't have prosecutions. You're not using the tools of the government when there are things that are going on wrong. Certainly, we've had newspapers without government. I mean, we don't have government.
No government in journalism.
Yeah. We don't want that.
No,
we've never had that. That's RT,
yeah.
Right? So that's private sector. Yeah. But we have had support, you know, in the private sector for it. And I think people recognize now that we want to have a diversity of information sources. And one of those, the diversity of information sources comes from platforms that allow more people to have a voice. There are a lot of online newspaper sources that have proliferated as a result of media platforms now. Some of them are paid for online services now. But also you have local. I have a local where I live, and we have McLean Patch that gives us McLean Patch news things. So when a fire happens in my neighborhood, I usually hear it from McLean Patch, even if I'm over here. So that, you know, that's online.
Laurie, you wanted to?
Oh yeah, I mean, I hopefully nothing that anyone said on the panel was taken to not recognize, appreciate, and ask for really the right collaboration model between governments and the private sector and civil society. I think the point that's important to register, if we can, is we have really big questions that we need to work through together, and there's an opportunity cost in focusing on, you know, one of those actors as the one that you should zero in on. So if anyone is holding on to the notion that if we can just get large tech companies under control, all of these problems go away, that's something we really want to think more deeply about, given where we are right now.
And certainly we do have situations where sometimes the government actors are also promoting disinformation themselves, right? You know who some of those characters are.
Yeah.
I see many more questions. Unfortunately, I also see here the eyes of my assistant begging me to wrap this panel up in a gentle way. Thank you very much for being here and also for your interest. I'm sorry we couldn't go into all of the questions, but I think there will also be more opportunities with the other panels to discuss very similar topics here. It's trade and tax. We already on trade, and this is going to continue here. So hopefully you can maybe bring your questions with a little different spin in there. Thank you very much also to all the panelists and for your interesting opinions. And
thank you to our moderator.
Thank you.